Hi, my name is Cam, and it's a very interesting topic. Today we're going to talk about some boring network interview questions, and that's a very interesting title, by the way. I introduced myself to someone right outside, and they, called me, oh, so you're the boring guy. Yes. It's a very interesting topic. Let's get started and talk about this. 30 minutes is a very, very short time to cover this topic. However, I'm still going to start with a story. The story is, many years ago, I was on this phone screen. I was actually being interviewed with a major company in the Bay Area. And I was not talking to an IC. I was talking to one of the leaders. Gentleman asked me a very interesting question. The question was, what's the total number of passengers that pass through the SFO, San Francisco Airport, every year? Well, what he did not know about me was I'm a professional traveler. I travel a lot. I've been to many major cities and almost every single major airport in the country. And I talk to people a lot about their travel habits, travel patterns. So it took me a couple of minutes to come up with a process, crunch a bunch of numbers, and I got back to him with a pretty good estimate. An estimate that later I found out was pretty close, actually amazingly close to the actual number. Between me and you, it's a very big room to share a secret. But anyways, I was kind of expecting a trophy. But he abruptly ended the interview, the phone screen, and I got the rejection email. Whether it was cheating or something else, but they were not interested in continuing the conversation because my estimate was way too accurate. Well, you just talked to the wrong guy, I guess, but that was the case. That was around the same time I started thinking, well, maybe there is a way to structure network engineering interviews better, be smarter, and maybe cover areas and skill sets that are not necessarily things that people can memorize. And when they answer that, you get really, really surprised. So that, and also defining the bar. So where is the bar for a junior level person, for a senior level person, for a very senior level person? That's how this whole thing got started. I work for the University of Southern California, and my teams are responsible for anything network related. Basically, we start from the fiber infrastructure we have across the city of Los Angeles, all the way to VXLAN and BGP and OSPF, and you name it, wired and wireless. Very proud of the team. This is the topic today we're going to cover here. By the way, the previous session was great. This is a more technical session, I guess, complement to that session. So let's get started and have a look. The way we structure this interview for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about a traditional network engineer and what it means when we talk about someone who is a traditional network engineer. Mostly we're referring to someone with routing and switching skill sets. Also, we have a lot of areas that over time put together as areas that we as a community traditionally tend to cover technically when we are interviewing people. And also, I do have a bunch of questions here, just samples, just to show you what are the questions that we ask, and maybe a couple of different ways to ask the exact same question, but in a different way. So let's have a look and say, so from a traditional perspective, when you're interviewing a network engineer, you're expecting the person to know TCP IP or UDP IP. I guess this is the base, right? And then we talk about something called the IGP of choice. The person, depending on your network, should know OSPF or ISIS, maybe more, maybe both. And BGP is a very interesting one. We do have some slides on BGP as well. We cover BGP, and that actually changed. It has changed over the past 10 years a lot. There are other areas that you can call them areas of expertise or specialty, service provider, data center, wireless, security, voice. This particular presentation, given the time that we have, we will be focused mostly on traditional routing and switching engineers, but you can apply pretty much the same concept to other areas. So for whoever is interested in literature, we have great expectations. These are the things that we, again, traditionally tend to cover. When you're hiring a network engineer, when you're interviewing a network engineer, these are the topics that we ask. We want the candidate to know the basics of TCP and IP, basically the structure of the packets, maybe some offset, maybe the sequence number, maybe some of the flags. We also talk about the session establishment process. The congestion control mechanism is a very interesting one. Let me give you an example. When you're interviewing someone, a junior level candidate, something that you cover, let's talk about the three-way handshake. When you know the three-way handshake, maybe a little bit slow start, and what happens when you get packet loss. And then later, maybe more senior level candidate, the behavior after the packet loss, how far we go down. We go down 50% all the way down, or maybe to one segment, and then back up. For the senior level candidates, depending on what you really need in your particular network, you even might want to get into things like different implementations. You can go as far back as Tahoe and Reno, start the story from there, and get to Cube and Cubic, and then see how they use those in your network. Also, we have the IGP of choice. Again, OSPF and ISIS. Two interesting protocols, right? We talk about the messaging system. We tend to ask questions about maybe some multi-level design, LSAs and LSPs, different kinds. Again, another interesting example here. Interviewing a junior level candidate when you're talking about OSPF. Let's talk about LSA type 7. Okay, now sort of you were trying to find out whether the candidate knows NSSA and how it works. A little bit more senior, you're talking about the translation process as the LSA hits ABR. A little bit more senior, I have multiple ABRs. How does that translation process work? Now you're talking about a very senior level candidate, and you ask questions like, okay, how do I minimize the number of LSA4s in my network? So there are a lot of opportunities here, and we have very interesting examples on each one of these. BGP is a very interesting one. So 4 major areas that we, again, tend to cover. One of them is BGP attributes. We all want to talk about different BGP attributes, and then there is a decision-making process. There is no way that you walk in a network engineering interview and you do not talk about the attributes or the decision-making process. Then there is traffic manipulation. Inbound and outbound. It's so famous that I can help you memorize and pass that question in 5 seconds. Someone asks an inbound question, AS path or MED. Someone asks an outbound question, it's either wait or local pref. And then we have BGP in other areas. Keep in mind, BGP has changed, again, over the past 10 years. We used to have BGP just as an edge technology between your network and the rest of the world. That paradigm has changed altogether. Now we have BGP in my data centers. We're going to have a leaf and spine presentation with Ross coming up. And interesting, again, same thing we have in enterprises. Many large enterprises today, they use BGP. So there are some great opportunities there too. But there is a problem with that. All of these topics that we tend to cover, they go after technical depth, the technical expertise of the particular candidate. How much do you know about this? Okay, I'm checking all these boxes. And that's how many of these boring interview questions were actually created. There is one big problem with that approach, and that's a leveling thing. I have heard and been to many interviews that we talk to a candidate. At the end of the interview, okay, there are conversations whether this candidate is a level 8 or a level 9 or maybe a level 7. Okay, it's a level 9, what, are we not hiring him? He's just too senior for that position. We just do not have the right data to make that decision. Again, another reason, those traditional questions cannot answer questions like this, cannot help you in cases like that. And especially if you have 2 candidates, same level, interview 2 candidates, it's Friday afternoon, we're making a decision. Which one was better? Well, they both knew the different LSPs, TLV types or ISIS. They both knew ISIS in TE. Maybe the all different kinds of LSAs in OSPF, even maybe LSA type, new LSAs that we use for IPv6. But they both did. Which one was a better candidate? Another problem with that, today we are interested in 3 great qualities, and the previous panel kind of covered that. One of them is creativity, innovation, and passion. You all know creativity and innovation. These are the 2 characteristics that I don't think we need to get into a lot of details. We have pieces. Today, no matter how junior you are, we have pieces of code that people need to put together and create something else. Same concept applies to many other things, including tools, different parts of the network. So it's sometimes about building something new, using things that people already built. But passion is another thing. It's a very amazing one. Sometimes when I interview candidates, You see the passion. The passion is definitely there. He or she is passionate about the brand, about the company, not necessarily this particular technology, this thing that is broken and has to be fixed for the customer. That is kind of passion we're looking for. I'm looking for that engineer, chases me down the hall, says, look, we talked about that solution, but keep in mind there are 2 other ways to go around this. Those 2 may not be necessarily technical, but here are those 2, and these are the cost and different timeline comparison and all the items about them. So that is the passion. And again, going back to the previous slide, that kind of questions and just being 100% focused on those technical areas that we all traditionally covered is not going to help you answer these questions and find these qualities in your candidates. So we're going to explore some of those topics. And it's kind of amazing. Whenever I present this, I have a much larger version of this deck. Always every single person in the room feels like I never ask any of these questions, but I heard them a lot. Anyways, let's have a look at the questions. I'm sure some of these questions are pretty familiar. This is a very, I guess, famous one. Difference between TCP and UDP. Let's go into some details here. When we ask this question, intention is we want to sort of see whether the candidate knows about layer 4, right? That's what it is. The problem with that is our ears, our brain, as interviewers, we are waiting to hear a word, and that word is reliability. If the candidate uses the word reliability, or this thing is reliable, or act back, you break off a chase. You're not going to press the candidate any harder. That's okay, he knows it. Let's check this box and move on to the next question. We have seen it many, many times. And we covered that, and it doesn't really give you any details as to the leveling, creativity. Okay, whether this candidate is going to be able to create anything for me, anything meaningful, if he or she is put in a situation. This is a scenario that we came up with. It's a very interesting case, a very simple case. I'm not saying it's technically 100% accurate from an aviation perspective, but that's a great example. You are now hired as an architect, as an engineer for an airliner, and you're trying to make this decision. They have a lot of planes up in the air. They're trying to locate those planes every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes means 80, 90 miles, right? Kilometers, probably. So what is the smartest way? You have to make a choice, TCP or UDP, and design the system for the company. So when you ask a question like this, you are engaging, you are asking the candidates to start a conversation with you rather than just a yes or no answer or just a technical keyword. The candidate needs to understand the stakes, all the risks. We're talking about people's lives. And also definition of success. And look at this. You have 2 choices. You have TCP and UDP, right? With TCP and UDP, well, down the TCP path, you're going to have reliability, meaning you're going to send that message, you're going to make sure the message is arrived. With UDP, you're not going to wait for anything. You don't have to establish the session. The round-trip time, which potentially could be pretty long, we're talking about hundreds of miles, that's not a factor there anymore. But the problem with UDP is, if you lose one of these handshakes, one of these connections back to your central point or your listener in general, you're going to have some problems. Then your estimate might be off by 80, 90 kilometers. So the candidate can just take sides, and you can engage in a very productive conversation. Now you have a chance to defend your reasoning, to give me enough reasons to convince me this is the better choice, and here are the reasons. This question, we did not ask anything about the cost, about the timeline, but the smarter candidates, they take it one step further. They're going to tell you that, look, this is good, my choice is A or B, however, keep in mind, there are other technologies out there, or this is the number of listeners you need, or maybe you know what, forget about this, let's build something else on top of that and sort of make up for this technology which may not be reliable. So that's a good example, I think, from candidate engagement perspective, and you can exactly see the thought process. Great candidates, they always ask a lot of questions, they get a lot of details, come up with something more than just a TCP or UDP answer that you check a box and move on. This is another one. Difference between OSPF and ISIS. I have no idea how many times I've been asked this question or heard that question. So the reason we ask this question, as usual, we want to know whether the candidate has any exposure to these protocols. I mean, what else, right? There are tables out there. There are books and tables out there. You can just look it up. And the table, OSPF on one side, ISIS on one side, memorize it, and pass the interview. Easy. But the bigger challenge there is, these two protocols under the microscope, they are not very similar. Yes, they are routing protocols. Yes, they are link state. Yes, there are these link state and algorithm conversations, but it pretty much stops there. Everything else is different. The messaging system is different. Neighbors different. Different modes are different. How you design a multi-level network is different. So these things are all different. But also, I don't see a lot of room for creativity. There is a bigger risk with this kind of question that I want to take advantage of this question and sort of expose that. Let's look at the next slide. It's called bias interviewing. Let me give you an example. And it's not really directly related to this particular question, but it is a big challenge in our space. Someone, gentleman right here, I ask you a question. Can you describe this room? Well, OK, we can talk about the square footage. We can talk about the ceiling. We can talk about the roof. We can talk about the building itself. We can talk about the stage. Of course, we have a lot of things here. But as you name all these things about this room, as you're trying to describe this room, there is a problem with that. The interviewer is just shaking his head like this. Not that one. You're close, but not that one. Not that one either. So now you've gone through 10 different things about this room, but you have not yet hit that very thing that he has in mind. OK, what is it? That's about the podium. We forgot to talk about this. Yeah, that's very important. This is the interview session. We go to the debrief, and when you go to the debrief, it's called hand-holding, right? I'm trying to explain to my colleagues how the interview went. He needed a lot of hand-holding. I ended up giving him a lot of hints for him to start talking about the podium. He covered everything. Even the guy talked about the carpet, but he forgot the podium. This is like important, right? So that's biased interviewing. Questions like that, difference between OSPF and ISIS, that you can list long list of items, that's not necessarily something that you can ask and say it's a safe and fair interview. Here is the scenario I used to, well, basically replace the other one, right? So I have very limited amount of time. It's a research team, very limited amount of time, and as usual, don't have enough money, right? Now the question is, I'm working on a new version of IP. Let's call that IP v6.5. And I want to come up with a routing protocol able to support IP 6.5. So what would be your choice, OSPF or ISIS? Probably no right or wrong answer, but this is exactly the problem that this industry, some people in the room, I'm sure we solved at some point, maybe 20 years ago, right? This is a real-world question. We had these two protocols and other routing protocols. The question was, IPv6 now is a reality. How do we make our routing protocols compatible, able to support those things? When you ask a question like this, the candidate needs to understand limitations. The time is critical, so I'm not going to design a routing protocol from scratch. OSPF v3 was a routing protocol from scratch. Great masterpiece, but something from scratch. We used the idea, but no one used v2 code to make changes to it, to add components to that. And also, fewest number of changes, that's a goal. You want to see your candidate able to articulate the reasoning. I pick ISIS because it's based on TLVs. TLVs give the protocol extendability. My protocol is extendable. I don't have enough time, so I'm not going to design the routing protocol from scratch. But a better candidate, maybe a great candidate, would give you that ISIS answer. But at the same time, toward the end of the answer, is going to say, by the way, what makes you think you should use ISIS or OSPF? How about BGP? How about extending BGP? We use BGP for a lot of things. You can update NLRIs. How about we use that for that purpose? This is great. This is a bonus point. Oh, awesome. Absolutely. So here we have 3 BGP scenarios, most of them very famous one. I'm sure you've seen all of them. BGP decision-making process. Candidate knows this or not. We start from next hop availability and wait, go all the way down. It's a memory test question, trust me. And I have seen people, flashcards, everyone's memorizing this. Case number 2, you've heard of the different ways that we use to describe our attributes: well-known, optional, transitive, non-transitive. Again, another area that's a memory test. Candidates do memorize these things. You're not going to get anything out of that interview if you ask that question. Okay, MED, well, it is transitive, it is not transitive. Okay, what? What does that really mean? He knows that. Okay, good memory, I guess. And this is a great replacement. Again, the same scenario, the same framework. You're running out of time, you don't have enough resources to design something from scratch. But at the same time, now you're developing a new experimental version of BGP. What would be the very first, or maybe a couple of few first attributes that you have to design? Keep in mind, your router should be able to talk, should be able to send messages to neighbors and process at a very minimum, that bare minimum, process and support BGP routing protocol. And this is one of the questions that I suggest we replace. In this case, your candidate, they need to know well-known and mandatory and how these things work. What does that really mean? How about my BGP knowledge? Is it just limited to simple labs? I brought up a bunch of BGP in different ASs, or I understand behind the scene what each one of those keywords really mean and how we can take advantage when we are designing networks. Number 3, this is an interesting one. Influence inbound traffic or outbound traffic. It's one of those famous questions that people ask all the time. And of course, it shows you whether the candidate has done this at least once in the past, or maybe they memorized it. Here is a problem with that. Again, no creativity there, no leveling there, and that memory problem. This is a better replacement. Let's think of this for a second. Now you have this junior engineer, and your junior engineer is making a great suggestion. Says, well, we want to influence our inbound traffic, let's use the MED. You are the senior person. Now you are in a position to challenge that decision. How would you challenge that decision? What's wrong with using the MED if you're trying to influence your inbound internet traffic? I'm not talking about 2 ASs. I'm talking about internet traffic. When you ask a question like this, you give the candidate the opportunity to expose their thought process. Now you help them see the limitations. How does the MED work? Now you will get down to the 2 keywords, transitive and non-transitive. Internet is a massive space with thousands of ASs. Can I use something that is non-transitive? Or maybe I should use something that is transitive. Maybe OSPF is a better option. This is one of those bonus questions. One of those questions that toward the end of the interview, when someone nailed that answer, I want to use OSPF, great, perfect, let's use OSPF. This is a bonus question. This is something that I think we can add to our question sets and ask, okay, but there's a little problem with that. OSPF is correct, but I do not have enough resources. I do not have enough skill sets and people to make any BGP changes. Come up with something else other than BGP, messing with BGP attributes. Now here is where you can see your candidate understands longer prefixes or shorter prefixes and how to route across the internet. That's one way of doing it. Smarter candidates might say, can you ask the question again? You ask the question again. He or she does not hear the word available or availability. Availability is not a concern. So who cares? Let's stop advertising that particular prefix out of one of your circuits. I know, if you were to lose this circuit, you would definitely lose connectivity with that prefix, but that would still satisfy this question. You're not going to have availability, but that's one of the possible answers. As you see, there are all sorts of different ways to engage candidates, to start conversations, to see the thought process, to see if they can go beyond what the book says. These are great skill sets that we want to see in our candidates. Creativity, imagination. What's the passion piece of that? The passion is exactly that, right? I want to do this, but what if the engineer is not available? My BGP guy is not available. Let's do it this way. Let's make some changes to your prefixes in terms of length and solve that problem. Interesting areas. I am done with this presentation, and we have 4 minutes left. The whole message, before I end this and open questions, the whole message here is there are many, many smarter ways that we can engage our candidates and have a conversation with them than just asking simple questions, textbook questions that have textbook answers. There is nothing wrong with asking textbook questions, but at some point you want to see their thought process. You want to see how they can be creative if not every single tool is available to them. Do they care about the cost? Do they care about the scale? Do they care about things like my timeline, my customers, stakes, how important this thing is? What if I make a mistake? The previous panel, we talked about risks. The whole key point here, I think they all mentioned, is calculated risk. Is this a calculated risk or not? If something is not a calculated risk and you cannot calculate the risk, we're not going to take that risk. But you have to see that thought process in your candidates. When your question is difference between ISIS and OSPF, you're not going to see the ability to go through the risks and assess the risk and do some calculated risk assessment. So that was the whole point. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And open questions, please.
Hi, Chris Woodfield with Salesforce. I wanted to know if, I noticed that the example questions that you threw out, I realize these are all examples, but when you do these kinds of interviews, and this may have changed over time, this might not have been the kind of question you would ask maybe 10 years ago, but people definitely should be asking these kinds of questions now about automation and orchestration and software skills. Is that something that you touch on in these types of interviews as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great point. I do not have the automation slides here, but automation, keep in mind, automation, we went through a long journey. We started with very, very basic things, then later to screen scraping and just basic CLIs. A great candidate with any kind of automation skill set, modern automation skill set, can answer my biggest concern. My biggest concern is over time, we purchased 5 different vendors. Now we have all sorts of codes, but here is my goal, here's my intention. I want to have one configuration, I want to have one operation model. How do we do that? How do we achieve it? It helps you see whether this candidate cares about the latest developments in this industry. Previous NANOGs, I think maybe even this one too, we had conversations on things like OpenConfig, like Yang models, all those things. These are the things, these are the qualities you want to see in our candidates. So absolutely, yes. And the solutions that you design, from a design perspective, is this something that can be automated? Some solutions cannot easily be automated. That's another key point. And simple better. Network design and architecture, there might be 5, 6 different ways to achieve the same goal. If simplicity is possible, then probably, yeah, that's a preferred option. If not, then what's the right way to automate that solution? Great question, thanks. Any other questions? Oh, all right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I will be happy to answer your questions through email or LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out. I would love to have these conversations. This is something that I, as an individual, or my team and my group, we cannot do just all by ourselves. We want to hear. We want to hear from you. I would love to hear from you, your experiences with good interviews and bad interviews, and all different aspects, gaps that you see in interviews, things that we can do and set the right bar for this. Software engineering, they've come a long way. Software engineering now has a very established interview process. Network engineering, we're those guys 15 years ago. We have to catch up. I'd be more than happy to get in touch with whoever in this room is interested, LinkedIn or email, please reach out. We can have a great conversation. Thank you.